Hi, everybody. This week we are going to be discussing administrative accountability. In this particular week, we are going to explore what administrative accountability is, and more importantly, we are going to analyze some of the mechanisms through which public servants or civil servants are basically held accountable for their actions, right? So, let's begin. So, first of all, let's try to define what exactly accountability is. So, according to this definition by Bowen 2007, accountability basically entails any social relationship in which an actor feels an obligation to explain and justify his or her conduct to some significant other, right? So, here what this definition basically implies is that. Accountability, first of all, is a two-way relationship, right? So let's say I'm a civil servant. That means that I will be under this obligation to explain my actions, to explain my conduct to somebody else, right? So who's this somebody else? What do we mean by this word significant other? So it could be my superior, it could be my boss, it could be my organization, or in the case of public services, it can actually be the citizens at large, because if you're working in public services, it means that ultimately, since you're working for the welfare of the people, you have to be accountable to the people, right? Another word for accountability can actually be answerability. So it means that that I have to be answerable for the actions that I take in my organization or during work, right? So now let's move on to what is administrative accountability, right? So, administrative accountability is basically the sum total of constitutional, statutory, administrative, and judicial rules and precedents, and the established practice by means of which public officials may be held accountable for their official action, right? So, this is a definition given by L.D. White. So, let's try to break down and sort of try to understand this definition, right? So, what do we mean by constitutional rules, etc.? So, constitutional rules are tasks or mandates which the Constitution provides you to do something, right? What are statutory rules? Statutory rules are rules basically which are set by your legislation. So, all your laws, pieces of legislation, they are basically statutory rules through which your public officials are held answerable or held accountable. What are administrative rules? So all public agencies have this sort of discretion to come up with their own rules and regulations to govern the way this organization is basically organized, or the way this organization is administered, right? So let's say I work for an organization such as Federal Board of Revenue, FBR, for instance, right? So FBR will have its own set of mechanism, the way it sort of governs, or the way it looks after its employees. For instance, I my sort of conduct in FBR would be governed or would be sort of monitored through these code of conduct or code of conduct rules and regulations. So if I violate this code of conduct, which has been set out by my organization, that I'll be held accountable for my actions. And what do we mean by judicial rules and precedents? So this word precedents is important. Any idea what precedents is? I'm sure if you read up or follow the news a bit, you might have come across this word. But generally speaking, precedents deals with sort of it has like legal connotations, and it's used quite a lot in law, right? So for instance, if your Supreme Court passed a judgment in one particular case, and it gave this binding decision or binding precedent for all future cases which are in similar in nature, right? So if a case appears which has more or less the same facts, and if it has been already decided upon, adjudicated upon by your Supreme Court, High Court, or any other court, then the lower court has to abide by this particular decision which has been given by a Supreme Court or High Court, right? So if like a Supreme Court passes a judgment, then all High Courts in Pakistan have to sort of make future decisions, future judgments in line with this previous Supreme Court judgment. So that's what we mean by precedents, right? And established practices, what do we mean by established practices? These are basically customary practices or some norms which are sort of set or established within public organizations, and you have to sort of abide by them. So this definition by LD White basically, I think, very nicely talks about different elements through which your public officials are brought to account or are made answerable whenever they are performing official action, right? So I hope you guys are clear what accountability in general is and what administrative accountability in particular is. So let's move on. So let's now discuss some of the features of accountability. So there are essentially three features of accountability which are discussed within literature. So one of this feature is that accountability is external in nature, right? What do we mean by this? So anybody who has to give an account or who has to be answerable for his actions has to give account to somebody outside the person, or to somebody else other than himself, right? So let's say I am a civil servant, I have to be answerable to my boss, right? It's not that I have to be internally, I'm going to be internally responsible for my actions, right? So when we talk about this element of conscience in human beings, it means that at times you are not really fearful of what the others or for the external bodies are going to be saying, but rather you or yourself have this element of conscience whereby you're going to be sort of checking your actions on your own, right? So you can say the traditional definition of accountability basically treats accountability as an external element. You are obligated to respond or to reply or give an answer to somebody who is outside of you, outside this particular person, right? Another feature of accountability is, as I previously mentioned, that it involves social interaction and exchange, right? So, how does it entail this to have this element of social interaction? So, one side has seeks answers or rectification from the other side, right? So, my boss is going to be sort of seeking answers for my actions, response for my behavior from me, right? So it's like that if, let's say, I violate a code of conduct, then my boss is going to be giving me some sort of penalty or going to be sanctioning my behavior. So this two-way relationship is actually this process of social interaction and exchange, that one person's actions basically are sort of responded by or looked after by another individual who's going to take actions, either punish me or penalize me, etc., right? Another feature of accountability is that it basically implies rights of authority. What does that mean? That some people who are basically calling for an account, right? So a boss is calling me, my superior is calling me on account, are asserting rights of superior authority over those who are accountable, right? What does that mean? That my superior, my boss, has more rights of authority, right? So the organization has provided him this superiority in the organizational, hierarchy, and through exercising this superior authority, he gets to ask answers for my action, right? So what is this indirectly, like if you read behind the lines, what does this tell you? That in public organizations, we've already discussed that there's this element of hierarchy, right? You have divided your organization in different levels, and different levels exercise different level of authority, different levels of power. So somebody who's above me, somebody who's in a higher grade as opposed to me. So this grading or this ranking is actually sort of a feature, or is a way to ensure accountability within organizations as well, right? So let's say if my HOD holds me accountable for my action, he has the right to do so. My colleague, on the other hand, since we are on the same rank, same sort of level of power, he or she doesn't get to ask me questions about my performance, for instance, right? So now let's move on. Let's discuss some perspectives on accountability. So, there have been basically two perspectives on accountability. One is considered to be the traditional perspective on accountability, the other one is more or less a contemporary perspective on accountability. First of all, let's go through this traditional perspective on accountability. So accountability has been traditionally viewed in terms of how can legislators scrutinize the actions of public servants and make them answerable for their mistakes, right? So the first thing is that the first and foremost element of accountability is that how do your lawmakers basically scrutinize or sort of analyze the actions of public servants, people who are working in the public services, and make them answerable for their mistakes, right? What are the mechanisms through which legislators or lawmakers hold people accountable, right? So, what does this tell you? This sort of refers back to this debate about politics and administration's dichotomy that we studied in one of the earlier weeks. So, if you remember from our discussion on politics administrative dichotomy, we discussed that politicians and public servants need to work in their own sphere. However, politicians sort of exercise higher authority over, your civil services. Why do politicians exercise higher authority? Why do legislators exercise higher authority? Because these people have been elected by the will of the people, so they are representing the mandate of the entire country. So they're basically the agents of us the citizens, right? So they get to ask the civil servants whether they are performing their job up to the mark or not, right? So this is one sort of view about how to go about accountability. Another perspective which falls under the traditional perspective is that how can voters make elected representatives answer for their policies? So in the first one, we were interested in how legislators are going to be sort of questioning public servants. But here you are more interested that how voters, people who have given the mandate to politicians or to elected representatives, how are voters going to ensure that they are going to be making policies which are in favor of the people at large, right? What is the mechanism available for that? And the last sort of feature which comes under this traditional perspective of accountability is that how can members of the public seek redress from government agencies and officials? So, what does this last point mean? It basically means that yes, if let's say if a particular government agency or a public servant violates my rights or does not provide me services which are guaranteed by the constitution, how can we as members of public or how can we as citizens ask for redress, which means how can we resolve or get our complaints against the government resolved, right? And government officials, how do we sort of what is the avenue available for us to go ask for remedies for ourselves, right? So in the last section of this particular lecture, we are going to go through some of the mechanisms which are available to us citizens, right? So let's now move on to the contemporary perspective on accountability, right? So one of the key sort of changes which has been documented in public administration literature has been that now accountability has been started being viewed as a sense of individual responsibility, right? And the idea is that you are no longer just operating from this sort of external fear of being asked or being questioned for your actions, but rather you have this internal sense which goes beyond this core external focus of the term accountability. What does that mean? That you have integrated these norms and values and you have this concern for public interest and you are genuinely motivated to work for the welfare of the people, right? So here, when I was initially explaining you the features of accountability, and I was mentioning this element of conscience. So this is essentially saying is that me as a public servant, I'm going to be internally driven to work for the best. So I'm going to be internally driven that I need to, my actions need to be in line with the code of conduct of my organization. For instance, I should not be engaged in corruption, bribery, because it's absolutely wrong, right? So here this contemporary perspective of accountability basically talks about individual responsibility of public managers or public servants, right? Another sort of contemporary view of accountability is that you basically view accountability as responsiveness, right? Remember, we discussed responsiveness when we were discussing some of the contemporary issues of public administration. Remember? So, we were discussing this tension between efficiency and responsiveness. So, more or less, this responsiveness is the same term that we are going to be using here. So, here, what you mean by accountability is that it's basically the extent to which governments pursue the wishes or needs of their citizens, right? So you see accountability not as something that you have to, answer to your boss or to your organization, but rather you see how much the government is actually pursuing the agenda or the wishes and the will of the people. If, like, how much is it providing services that the people genuinely need, right? And under this sort of view of accountability as responsiveness, you have two distinct relationships between the officials and the wider public. So what are these two distinct relationships? So one is that your public agencies are expected to be responsive to elected officials, right? Elected officials, why? Because again, these people are reflecting the will of the people. They are, they have been given the mandate of the citizens, and indirectly they are sort of representing what we the citizens have actually chosen for our country, right? So your civil services or people working in public agencies have to be responsive to the needs of these public servants. So if a public servant wants you to come up with a reform proposals or sort of implement a set of reform initiatives in the health sector, for instance, right? So you have to, your public servants or your civil servants have to give in to these demands and have to implement all of these things. Similarly, another feature is that your agencies providing services should be responsive to the needs of their clients, right? Who are the clients? The general public, the general citizens, right? So if you're an official working for NADRA, for instance, you have to sort of address all the complaints or sort of entertain all the needs or wishes of the people who are coming to you, sort of wanting to get services from your organization. So, one of the distinct features about the public sector is that, unlike the private sector, in the public sector, you have this problem of many eyes, right? What do we mean by that? That you do not almost always know that who exactly is the accountee. Why? Because there are multiple people who are going to be holding you accountable for your actions if you're a public servant. So, in literature, this particular problem is called the problem of many eyes, which basically means that many eyes are overlooking your performance, right? So now the question is, who is the accountee? Who is the person who is going to hold somebody accountable? So there are various accountabilities, right? So you have organizational accountability, political accountability, legal accountability, administrative accountability, and professional accountability. So what do we mean by organizational accountability? So if you're a public servant, if you're held accountable to your superiors, that will qualify as a organizational accountability. Political accountability means that you're also answerable to the elected representative. So let's say I'm somebody who's working in the Ministry of Climate Change, right? So let's say I'm a grade 18 officer. So I'm going to be answerable to the Minister of Climate Change, who is a elected representative. And this minister is going to be ultimately be going to be answerable by the Prime Minister of the country, right? Similarly, if I have legal accountability as well, if let's say I violate certain rules and regulations, certain laws, then the courts are going to be sort of scrutinizing my actions. Another sort of sort of form of accountability is administrative accountability. That is that if you're somebody who's working in, let's say, the power sector, or you're working in some oil and gas sort of agency, right? So you're going to have external inspectors or regulators or even auditors who are going to be checking your performance, right? So we have already discussed that you have this Office of Auditor General of Pakistan, which scrutinizes the performance of different ministries in the country, right? Similarly, you have professional accountability. So you are answerable to your professional peers peers. And this form of accountability, I think, is particularly sort of relevant in the case of if you're a doctor working in the public servant. So, apart from all of these other accountabilities, generally doctors and dentists sort of have this code of conduct for operating or providing sort of medical services, right? So you also have accountability to your professional peers as well, that for instance you should not discriminate when it comes to figuring out who to provide medical attention to or not, right? So these are just different sort of accountabilities which are present in the public sector, unlike the private sector where if you're working in the private sector, you're just more or less accountable to your organization, right? To your superiors, and no elected officials are going to be sort of scrutinizing your actions. Courts can, for instance, however, in a scenario whereby you are involved in some sort of corruption or bribery, or if you have violated the rights of third parties, etc., right? So now let's move on. So here we are going to basically discuss that what are some of the different ways in which organizations or sort of public agencies or legislative agencies try to ensure control or try to ensure or maintain control of these organizations, right? So there are two main systems of administrative control in the public sector. So first you have some set of internal controls which are in place in the organization, and you also have some external controls present in the public sector as well. So what do we mean by these internal controls and external controls? So internal control is any sort of control which is fitted inside the administrative machinery and operates within the administrative organization, right? So any sort of mechanism which is sort of designed within the organization to hold people accountable, that would be an example of an internal control, right? So it consists of activities like directing, regulating, sort of supervising the work of your subordinates, advising them, inspecting and evaluating their performance, right? So, in a bit, I'll show you some examples of these internal and external controls, but just to let you guys know, for instance, every year, if my boss fills an annual appraisal report, which is like annual performance report, sort of talking about how did I perform in the organization. So that's an example of an internal control because it's fitted within the administrative organization, right? So what is an external control? So external control, as opposed to the internal control, is fitted outside the administrative machinery, and all of these controls work outside your organization. However, they work within the general constitution framework of the system, right? So this type of control is exercised by external bodies. Your own superior is not going to be exercising external control, but rather you will have bodies like the legislature or judiciary scrutinizing your actions. So let's go through the examples of these internal controls and external controls one by one. So first of all, your external control is exercised through administrative process, right? So what is the administrative process? That your civil bureaucracy is basically controlled and directed by the Prime Minister and his cabinet of ministers. And this is a given thing that the civil bureaucracy is basically answerable to the elected officials, right? So this is one way. Your prime minister or your cabinet ministers are going to be holding secretaries of different ministries accountable for their actions, right? So another sort of system of internal control is having a hierarchical order within your organization. And when we were discussing bureaucracies, we saw that hierarchy or a system of hierarchical order is a key feature of bureaucracies around the world, right? So what is the rationale for having this hierarchical control? That the system of hierarchy basically monitors the behavior of subordinates and enforces accountability, right? So my boss is going to monitor my behavior as a subordinate, and if my behavior is not in line with what I'm supposed to do, he's going to call me to account, right? So your administrators or public servants are basically, in other words, made responsible to their superiors for whatever actions or dealings that they perform whenever they are performing their public duty. Another way to in which your internal control is exercised, I've already mentioned, is through the system of annual confidential reports. And these reports or these performance reports basically ultimately affect the future career progression of civil servants, right? So this is a tool that superiors have in their hand. If, let's say, in this year I do not perform well on my annual confidential report, then it's going to have an implication on whether I will be promoted to the next rank or not, right? So that's one way. Another way through which internal control is exercised is through this budgetary control, right? So the budget, you already know, is some sort of financial control, is a planning mechanism within an organization. So how do you ensure budgetary control? So each organization, each ministry or department is allocated a certain sort of budget for their actions or the activities that they are going to perform in the next fiscal year. So if some minister, or sorry, if some secretary violates or sort of overuses this amount, then naturally is going to be held accountable for misuse of these funds. So more or less all the ministries have this separate function of account keeping. So through that, you sort of ensure that your money is not basically misused. Similarly, you have professional ethics in organizations, and professional ethics are basically code of conducts, and they basically provide guidelines and sanctions for ensuring that individuals are performing their behavior in the correct fashion, right? So, just to give you an example, most of the organizations, most of the public organizations in Pakistan have this code of conduct. Again, I was giving the example of FPR. So, FPR is a code of conduct there. It's very clearly stipulated that you cannot engage in bribery, you cannot perform corruption, you cannot take gifts of a certain value from individuals, right? So, all of these things are included in your code of conduct. And the day you violate this code of conduct, there's going to be like a hearing committee, and it's going to basically decide on the nature of your violation of the code of conduct, and ultimately is going to penalize you for your action. And the last sort of way in which internal control is exercised is through this administrative leadership. So your leader or superior basically motivates and inspires you to work efficiently, right? So that's another way of ensuring that people are actually performing their duties in their true letter and spirit, and they're not violating or they're not engaging in sort of some sort of misconduct. And leadership basically plays a key role in the way you perform your work, right? So we've already discussed quite a lot in the past that motivation plays a key role in the productivity and efficiency of public servants. And one way to ensure that you have a motivated workforce in your organization is to have really inspiring leadership which encourages you to take the right action, right? So these are some examples of internal controls which are exercised within public sector organizations. So now let's move on to external control. So what are the tools, mechanisms through which agencies are scrutinized by external bodies? So let's go through these one by one. The first and foremost control that you have is this control of legislative control, basically. That is, that your legislative branch has the power to empower your agency, to limit the work of your agencies, to investigate or censure the executive branch, which is the bureaucracy, right? So, how does the legislative branch has this authority? I think told you all public organs created by the constitution, right? So legislative branch has this power that it can actually change the powers of these agencies by changing the law, right? So let's say you decide to change act which has created the institution of Nadra, for instance, right? So if you're trying to limit the powers of Nadra or if you're trying to enhance the powers of Nadra, so legislative branch has the power to do so, right? Similarly, you exercise external control on the bureaucracy or on public servants through having debates and discussions in the parliament, right? So, what happens is that these debates and discussions, which happen on the floor of the parliament, essentially allow elected officials to sort of report any misdoing, any misconduct done by the civil services, and they can actually figure out or point out any loopholes within the administration. In the past, I'm sure if you have followed the news, you must have seen that if some public servant is involved in some sort of wrongdoing, some minister of the house, somebody sitting in opposition would raise this concern on the floor of the parliament, right? So, if you guys remember in the past, there were some extrajudicial killings by this individual who was working in the police services of Pakistan. So, there was a lot of debate about these extrajudicial killings on the floor of the parliament. So, this is just one example of external scrutiny of the bureaucracy. Another way to exercise external control is through passing laws. So, this is more or less linked to this legislative control. Through passing laws, the legislature again can control the activities of the administration, right? So, it can either empower or limit the work of the administration, right? So, more or less, it's similar to this legislative control. I forgot to mention this bit about investigate, right? So, your legislation actually has the power that if some organization is found to be doing some sort of wrongdoing, it can ask for an inquiry, right? So, just recently, you must have seen that there was this report launched regarding the wheat and sugar shortage crisis. And this particular report was actually ordered by your executive government, by your sitting government, to investigate which individuals, which government agencies were involved in the shortage of this particular crisis, right? So, this legislative control is slightly different from passing laws because here investigations regarding certain issues happen, but here through passing laws, you're just ensuring that you're either by passing legislation, you are either expanding or sort of limiting the role of certain public agencies, right? Another way to exercise external control is through control of appropriations. What do we mean by appropriations? These are budgetary sort of resources which are provided to different ministries, different organizations working in the public sector. So essentially, your legislature, your elected officials exercise control over administration through the powers of allocation of money, right? So, in 1 year, the government decides to, let's say, provide 10 million to a particular agency, and next year it realizes that this 10 million wasn't adequately used by this agency or this ministry. So, the next year, the government has the power to cut down this level of funding or this level of budget which was provided to a particular agency, right? So, this is another way of exercising control on the bureaucracy. And the last way of sort of ensuring or exercising external control over the bureaucracy is through the system of audit and report. I've already mentioned that there's this Office of the Auditor General, which basically conducts third party or independent reports or investigations or audit of the accounts of the administrative departments, and it ultimately reports to the legislature. It provides this report to the house of the country, basically to the parliament, right? So we already saw that we have this Auditor General of Pakistan, and this Office of AGP basically provides reports to this committee, parliamentary committee called the Public Accounts Committee, and these reports are made public to the entire country. And the reason why you want to audit and report these administrative departments and ministries is because you want to see whether your ministries are using the allocated funds in a adequate manner, right? So let's move on. So another thing which I wanted to keep it as a separate heading is basically public control, which is actually a form of external control. And this is basically how the public exercises control of the administration, how the people, right? You and I basically exercise control over the bureaucracy or through over, generally the government. So through elections, so elections are a powerful, you can say, mechanism to ensure, that the right way is being pursued or the right policies are being pursued by the government. So if we are unhappy with the performance of a government in this 5 year term, naturally we are going to give our decision and going to elect another party, right? So it's going the sitting government or the party which is in majority ultimately is going to run the affairs of the country, and it's going to have an impact on the way the bureaucracy is working. So if we are unhappy in the next cycle, voters are not going to vote for them. So, another way to sort of exercise control over administration is through pressure groups, right? So, what are pressure groups? They're just simply a group of organized individuals who try to pursue special interests. They could be group of NGOs, activists, lobbyists, a group of traders as well. So, if you guys remember that a couple of months ago, when the Imran Khan government wanted to impose taxation on traders, and these traders from around the country basically protested quite a lot, and then the government actually ended up negotiating with them. So, this is just another way in which the public tries to exercise control over the government apparatus. Similarly, advisory committees are another way to sort of exercise control on the bureaucracy as well as the elected officials. Advisory committees are just a group of individuals who provide, advisory services to the government, and oftentimes the government voluntarily sort of hires a group of experts or advisors to guide it in the different policy making processes, right? So, a lot of times, countries around the world, governments around the world try to gauge public opinion through conducting different surveys, conducting different polls as well. So, if let's say public opinion is considered to be negative about certain aspects or certain policy proposals, then naturally the government tries to, withdraw that particular proposal and tries to introduce something in which the opinion actually tends to be positive. So, generally speaking, public opinion matters quite a lot for the government as well when it comes to exercising or implementing certain policy interventions, because ultimately the goal or sort of the aim of the government is to keep the public happy so they can actually get elected in the next election cycle. So now let's move on to discussing this question that we had initially, that how can members of the public seek redress from government agencies and officials, right? So this was one of the questions under the traditional view of accountability that I showed you in some of the previous slides. So there are quite a lot of remedies through which the public can actually seek, redress from the government agencies. If their rights have been violated, they can actually go to certain platforms and ask for their rights to be provided, right? So for the purpose of this particular lecture, we are only going to be focusing on one of the remedies, and this is the Ombudsman Remedy, right? So who's an ombudsman? It's basically an independent and non-partisan officer who is appointed by legislature to deal with complaints from citizens against administrative injustice and maladministration, right? So it's quite a loaded definition. So let's try to break it down. So first of all, the important thing is that it's this particular office or the person who's holding this office has to be independent and non participant, which means that you shouldn't have any political affiliations. And this person is appointed by your legislature, and the goal or the role that's played by this particular office is that he has to deal with complaints from citizens against any sort of injustice or wrongdoing done by the government apparatus, right? And again, in different countries of the world, the Ombudsman Remedy is actually a constitutional obligation. That is, your constitution mandates the country to establish this office. And just a few characteristics of this office of the ombudsman: that it's legally established, which means is that your legislation or your constitution provides a legal cover for this particular office. It's independently functioning, as I just mentioned, that it has to make decisions on its own without fear that its decisions are going to have repercussions for the person who's holding the office of the ombudsman. The third feature of this office is that it's external in nature, which means that it operates outside of the administration, actually, right? So the sitting government should not be in a position that it should influence the office of the ombudsman, because naturally, if the sitting government has the opportunity to sort of influence the decisions of ombudsman, then you and me, citizens, will be actually a little reluctant to go up to this institution to file any sort of complaints against the government. And the last and most important feature of the Office of the Ombudsman is that it needs to be publicly accessible and visible. What does that mean? That anybody, irrespective of where they come from or irrespective of their ethnicity, gender, should be able to approach this office to seek redress from this particular institution. And it needs to be visible, which means that office should proactively position itself in such a manner that people are willing to approach this office. So these are just some generic characteristics that should be followed by the office of the ombudsman. So let's move on to the ombudsman system in Pakistan. I just want to give you a brief overview about it. So, in Pakistan, this particular office is called the Office of the Wafaki Muhtasib. In other words, it's the federal ombudsman, and this was actually created during President Zia's time through a presidential order issued in January 1983. So, we do not have this Office of the Ombudsman prior to 1983. And since then, there were a few reforms which were passed to sort of empower this ombudsman a little more. So we had this Federal Ombudsman Institution Reforms Act that was passed in 2013. It actually gave enhanced powers to this office and the investigation officers. I don't want to go in too many details about how the powers were enhanced. Another key feature was that these federal ombudsman offices are now actually required to resolve complaints within a period of 60 days from registration to final decision. So, this was a key reform that was introduced in 2013 because it basically tried to make this office very efficient in terms of dispensing the complaints of the citizens. So, in other words, that today, if I have some issue with, let's say, the institution of NADRA, or let's say PTCL, or for instance some gas utility company like Sui Gas, I can actually file a complaint in the Federal Ombudsman Office, and this complaint should be resolved by within 60 days. So this particular, you can say, Reform Act actually made the process of complaint resolutions really efficient in the case of Pakistan, right? Similarly, your ombudsman institutions are actually established at both provincial, and federal level. So you have regional offices which are located in Karachi, Hyderabad, Dera Ismail Khan, Lahore, Quetta, Peshawar, etc. These are regional offices of the federal ombudsman, right? So you have the federal ombudsman with its regional offices. However, on the other hand, you also have some provinces which have established ombudsman offices at the district level as well, right? So you can just, if you're more interested, you can just Google some of these ombudsman offices, and you can actually see that how can you file a complaint regarding certain institutions. So you have multiple ombudsman institutions. Some of these are very general in nature in terms of the type of complaints that they entertain. Others are actually very specialized. So you have this federal ombudsman, so it deals with all kinds of complaints except a few. In a bit, I'll show you which kind of complaints cannot be entertained by this office. You also have a federal tax ombudsman. So this office or this ombudsman individual only deals with taxation related matters. You have a banking muhtasib. You have a banking ombudsman. So this particular office deals with banking related issues. You have an insurance muhtasib. If you have any insurance related issues, complaints, it can be directed to this institution. And this last institution is the Federal Ombudsman Secretariat for the protection against harassment of women at workplace. So this is a relatively newer development, and in this ombudsman office, it's particularly dedicated to any complaints relate from women against their harassment. Right. So these are just some different institutions which are available in the case of Pakistan, where citizens can actually get sort of redress from these institutions. You might be wondering if this particular institution is actually successful. Surprisingly, it is. So you can look up online. This ombudsman office, the federal ombudsman office, actually regularly shares a report regarding the complaint resolution rate. So they have been able to dispense a lot of issues quite efficiently. And in fact, even if you face an issue, you can actually file a complaint by using the Federal Ombudsman website, right? So I just was mentioning earlier that there are certain things that the Ombudsman Secretariat or the Ombudsman Office does not entertain. So these are the policy matters about which it doesn't take any complaints, matters which are under judicial consideration by some court. So the ombudsman office will not entertain it. So let's say if I have an existing or ongoing judicial case which is pending in front of some court, I cannot sort of bring the same issue in the office of the ombudsman because the judiciary is already trying to resolve it. Similarly, you cannot file a complaint related to external affairs by using the Office of the Ombudsman. You cannot lodge a complaint related to any, defense-related matters, right? And last, service matters are also not under the Ombudsman Secretariat. So now the question is, what do we mean by service matters? So these are any sort of matters which are related to civil services employment. So if I'm a civil servant, I'm an aggrieved party, I'm unhappy with my organization, so I cannot go to the Federal Ombudsman office and lodge a complaint there, right? So instead, if you guys remember from our topic on civil services of Pakistan, civil servants already have a mechanism to lodge complaints. Do you guys remember what this mechanism is? Yeah. So it's basically called the Federal Services Tribunal. So civil servants can just go there, file a complaint there, and the issue should be resolved there. So these are just some areas or issues or policy matters which are basically not dealt by the ombudsman system. So this basically concludes our lecture on administrative accountability. I hope you were able to understand what are some of the mechanisms through which public servants are held accountable. So, see you guys in the next lecture.